This is a review of Getsu Fuuma Den. Konami put this out in 1987 in Japan for the NES, and it never graced Western shores. We have esteemed translator RPGe to thank for this translation. Just for reference, that's the same RPGe that did the first fan translation of Final Fantasy V, supposedly the first fan translation of an RPG ever to be finished. But hey, we're here to talk about Getsu, so let's get on with it already. Getsu Fuuma Den is one of those NES games that takes on multiple genres. Here, we've got an action platformer, an RPG, and a wizardry-style dungeon crawler. While it is a neat experiment, it doesn't make for a compelling experience. In terms of difficulty, there's a stark contrast between gameplay modes, from super easy to decently challenging. None of the gameplay is great, though it will at least make for a pleasant way to pass the time. Most of your time in Getsu will be spent in its side-scrolling action platformer segments. Although these are typically light on platforming, you'll encounter a wide selection of enemies, and more often than not, they'll be pretty neat. You'll face bowling clowns, heads that fly in Gradius-like formations, and oversized scorpions. Sometimes, the sun itself will have it out for poor old Fuuma. Fuuma is the guy you control for the duration of the game. Although it features a smartly crafted cast of enemies, Getsu's RPG elements muffle the experience. Defeating enough enemies will earn you a level up, increasing Fuuma's attack and defense. At the start of the game, the enemies are balanced and force you to play well. However, Fuuma will outpace his foes as you continue. The new enemies you encounter won't be strong enough to make up for your increased power and defense. Eventually, you'll skate right through the side-scrolling parts. Unfortunately, the music rarely changes, making these segments even more tiresome. On the other hand, there's a ton of different locales and enemies to see, and they're all rendered in a really cool style that you have to admire. The idea behind the level-up system isn't so bad. The side-scrolling portions are strung together by a world map not unlike Super Mario Bros. 3. Every time you run into a gate icon, you'll play through a side-scrolling stage. The game would be boring if you only played each stage once, so these gate icons stick around even after you've passed through them. However, with the level-up system, playing earlier stages becomes easier and easier as you progress in the game. If you want to revisit an early portion of the game, you won't have much trouble in doing so. The problem is, the enemies in later stages don't keep pace with you. As a result, the enemies in all parts of the game get easier as you progress. The world map is also populated by huts and shops. Huts contain people willing to talk, although I found that this was usually just flavor text. In shops, you can purchase new weapons and items. Some of these can only be used once, so it'll behoove you to take note of where certain things are sold, in case you need to buy more. Things stay a little fresh with the help of additional weapons. Your basic sword will always be your most powerful weapon, but you can find or buy weapons that give you a tactical advantage. Choose the throwing stars to attack enemies at a distance, or use the fireball thing to clear out the ground below. I won't spoil the cooler ones here, but rest assured, they are cool indeed. Then, out of left field, you'll wander into a dungeon featuring an over-the-shoulder perspective. Fortunately, these remain engaging throughout the game. Each dungeon is a maze with a unique construction, so you won't be able to glide through these like you can with the side-scrolling portions. Though the exit can be sussed out without the aid of a pencil and paper, you may want to have those things handy just in case. Be warned though, be very careful if you draw your own map. Just to keep things lively, you'll also face one-on-one random encounters while navigating these mazes. Unfortunately, during battle scenes, sprites flicker quite a lot, so it can be difficult to capture both Fuuma and his enemy within the same footage. Rest assured though, when you're playing the game yourself, everything looks fine. Here, an enemy can attack Fuuma by either touching the bottom of the screen or summoning projectiles. It's easy to just plain hit an enemy, but if you go about it without any finesse, you'll inevitably take too much damage and you won't be able to clear the maze. There's a sweet spot you want to strike on every enemy, which is always at the middle of the creature, or at least nearby. Hit it there a few times, and it'll be out of your hair in no time. Interestingly enough, the RPG elements don't dull these guys nearly as much as their side-scrolling siblings. You'll always need to be on your toes when you encounter an enemy in a dungeon. That's not to say they're challenging, but it's a nice test of reflexes to offset the memorization-happy maze exploration. If the idea of giant mazes doesn't put you off, the dungeon bosses might. At the conclusion of each dungeon, Fuuma enters a short side-scrolling portion, followed by a unique boss. While by no means brilliant, each boss calls for a unique strategy, and you'll need some decent reflexes too. The thing is, if you lose all of your lives to this boss, you'll have to find your way through the dungeon maze again. I'm a fan of this approach. Defeating each boss takes a little experimentation and requires you to hone your reflexes, so I found myself getting a game over at least once or twice at each one. As a result, I had to reach the end of each maze more than once. But I was often confused the first time I got through a maze. I didn't realize how I had gotten to the end. The nice thing is, subsequent visits made me master the maze. Basically, this system prevents you from just blundering through a maze. You have to know what you're doing. I have to admit, though, I don't think anyone would blame you if you used a guide to get through these dungeons. There's nothing too special about any of them, so if you don't dig mazes, you won't be missing out on anything by using a guide. You'll find some loose themes at work in the maze structure. For instance, the second dungeon seems to feature quite a few loops, but there's not really anything noteworthy. In the end, I'm not quite on the fence with Getsu. Although the side-scrolling portions let you breeze through, they almost strike a nice contrast against the harsh dungeons. And the dungeons do feature hardy mazes and nifty bosses. But then, I have to admit that there's nothing unique about anything here to make you seek out this game in particular, unless you really dig the graphics. I could see value in playing this if you want some idea of the range the NES could pull off in terms of gameplay, or if you're interested in Konami history. For anyone else, you'll find some fun in this game, but there are better uses of your time. Now that the review is over, I've got some extra things to mention. Getsu has a pretty cool password save feature. It saves your experience, your items, and even your location. This is probably one of the biggest advantages of the fan translation, as it uses Latin characters for passwords. You start with 3 lives. The penalty for dying is restarting the stage, and if you lose all your lives, you'll get kicked out to the world map, but you'll be right next to the stage that you just failed. This means that continuing is fairly gracious, since you won't lose much progress. If you die during dungeon combat, you'll start that fight over again without losing any progress in the dungeon. Also, you keep all of your experience points when you die. In other words, it follows Dragon Quest rules. Since there's no English manual, it can be a little hard to figure out how to switch weapons and items. To select a weapon, pause and press B. To select an item, pause and press A. I'd also like to mention some games that Getsu Fuuma Den reminded me of. I mentioned that it's one of those NES games that takes on multiple genres. There are quite a few NES games that do this, and oftentimes, the genres clash. Here are some of the more popular games that follow this formula. There's Blaster Master, Bayou Billy, and Battletoads. Hey, you know what? All of those games begin with the letter B. Unlike the dungeons in Getsu, Metroid and Castlevania games are good examples of mazes that deserve to be mastered. Don't use guides for these games. Unfortunately, I'm not too familiar with 3D dungeon crawlers, so I can't give you any advice on something like Shining in the Darkness or Phantasy Star. Kid Icarus uses the platforming/dungeon crawler/RPG formula, only it does a much better job of balancing each one. While the normal stages are still easier than the dungeons, there's not the huge gulf between the two that you find in Getsu. Kid Icarus features an okay cast of enemies, but it's also a fair bit shorter than Getsu Fuuma Den, preventing it from overstaying its welcome. Be aware, though, that Kid Icarus also tests your platforming skills much more than Getsu does. Socket, while lacking in RPG elements and a world map, uses a similar formula to Getsu Fuuma Den. Each world contains a linear platforming stage, then a maze, then a boss. Socket is also billed as a poor Sonic ripoff with awesome music. Getsu is often associated with the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game for the NES, since both were developed by Konami. They both feature similar controls, sound effects, and world maps. I wouldn't be surprised if they used the same engine. That's it for this review, folks. My next review will cover Blue Blink. It's a TurboGrafx-16 platformer based on an anime by the guy who did Astro Boy. Well, hope to see you then.